In late January 2025, copper hit $15,000 per metric ton. Aluminum cost $3,100. That is a gap of more than 4 to 1. And in March 2025, the Chinese government quietly issued a formal policy paper telling its manufacturers to stop using one and start using the other, not a suggestion buried in a footnote. A formal government document seen by Reuters sent to the companies that build cars, power grids, and home appliances across the world's largest manufacturing economy. Most people in the West never heard about it. But the companies that mine copper noticed, and the analysts at JP Morgan noticed. And by the time you finish this video, you will understand exactly why this quiet policy paper out of Beijing could reshape the global copper market before 2030. Here is the thing. Copper has been the default conductor in electrical wiring for roughly 2 centuries. It is in your walls. It is in your car. It is in the cables that carry power from a solar farm to the grid. Every electric vehicle on the road today is packed with it. The average EV uses somewhere between 80 and 100 kilograms of copper. That is about 4 times what a standard gasoline car uses. So when the world started building more EVs, the logic was simple. More EVs means more copper demand. Mining companies bet on it. Commodity traders bet on it. The whole industry built its forecasts around it. China just bent that logic in half. Before we get into it, if you enjoy videos like this, hit the like button right now. These take a serious amount of research and time to put together, and every like pushes this to more people who would love it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Now let's get into it. To understand what China actually did, you need to understand the material at the center of this story: aluminum. It is the most abundant metal in the Earth's crust. It is what your soda can is made from. It is the frame of a commercial airplane. It has been sitting in plain sight for decades. And for most of those decades, the electrical industry looked at it and said, not good enough. Because aluminum has only about 60% of copper's electrical conductivity, run the same current through a copper wire and an aluminum wire of identical size, and the aluminum wire gets hotter, loses more energy, and in some cases fails. That is a real engineering problem. It is not a marketing problem, it is physics. But here's where it gets uncomfortable for the copper industry. That problem has been solved. Not perfectly, not in every application, but at the scale that matters for electric vehicles and power infrastructure. Advances in crimping technology and connector design have made aluminum wiring a workable, tested, and now commercially viable substitute. You need a slightly thicker gauge of wire, about 1.5 times the cross-section of copper, to carry the same current. That adds some volume. But aluminum is so much lighter that the finished cable assembly still ends up 40 to 50% lighter than its copper equivalent. For an electric vehicle where every kilogram of weight you remove translates directly into more range per charge, that is not a minor detail. That is a selling point. Tesla figured this out first. In 2019, when Tesla launched the Model Y, it used aluminum wiring in the vehicle's harness. That was not widely reported at the time. It was not the headline feature, but it was there. And the Chinese EV makers who were building their own vehicles and tearing apart competitors' cars to study them saw it. Terry Wojciechowski is the president of Caresoft Global, an engineering consultancy based in the United States that physically disassembles vehicles to examine how they are built. His team tears apart cars from every major manufacturer and documents every component. In 2025, Wojciechowski confirmed publicly that Chinese EV makers Avatar, Xpeng, and Xiaomi have all made the switch to aluminum wiring in their vehicles. Not planning to, not testing it, already done. Xiaomi made it public in April 2024 when the company confirmed its SU7 sedan uses aluminum wiring harnesses. Xiaomi's statement at the time was direct. Aluminum wire is 30% lighter than copper, and Xiaomi called it an industry trend, not a cost-cutting measure. That framing matters, because when a company says cost-cutting, buyers hear cheaper product. When a company says industry trend, buyers hear this is where everything is going. Xiaomi chose the second framing, and they were not wrong. Now look at the supplier side. Zhonver is a Chinese EV parts company. It makes wiring components for the vehicles coming out of Chinese factories. In 2023, aluminum wiring made up about 20% of Zhonver's total sales. By 2025, that number had risen to 30%. Feng Lu, Zhonver's sales director, confirmed those figures. That is a 50% relative increase in 2 years, inside a single supplier. Multiply that pattern across the hundreds of parts companies feeding China's EV industry, and you start to see the scale of what is happening. But the March 2025 policy paper is what turned a market trend into a national strategy. The document, as reported by Reuters, was a formal government recommendation. It told manufacturers across 3 sectors, automotive, power generation, and home appliances, to substitute aluminum for copper wherever technically feasible. The Chinese government did not mandate it with penalties for non-compliance. It did something more effective. It signaled. In China's industrial economy, a formal policy paper from the central government is not background noise. It is a direction. It tells state-owned enterprises, private manufacturers, and the banks that finance them which way the wind is blowing. And the wind in March 2025 was blowing very clearly away from copper. Why did Beijing do this? 2 reasons, and they reinforce each other. First, cost. Copper at $15,000 per metric ton is a problem for any manufacturer trying to compete on price. China's EV makers are already in a brutal domestic price war. BYD, Li Auto, NIO, XPeng, and dozens of smaller brands are fighting for market share with aggressive discounts. Every yuan saved on raw materials is a yuan that can be passed to the consumer or kept as margin. Aluminum wiring can cut the cost of a wiring harness by 30 to 40%, according to suppliers cited by Reuters. On a vehicle with several kilometers of wiring, that adds up fast. Second, supply security. China imports a significant share of the copper it uses. The country produces copper domestically, but it is not self-sufficient. Aluminum is a different story. China is the world's largest aluminum producer. It has the smelters, the bauxite supply chains, and increasingly the recycling infrastructure to produce aluminum at scale without depending on anyone else. Shanghai Metals Market, a metals data firm, has said the March 2025 policy reflects China's long-term goal to build a recycled aluminum industry capable of producing 15 million metric tons annually. That is not just about EVs. That is about making a critical industrial material domestically abundant and domestically controlled. Think about that for a second. China is simultaneously the world's biggest EV market, the world's biggest EV manufacturer, and the world's biggest aluminum producer. When it decides to connect those 3 facts with a policy paper, the consequences reach well beyond its own borders. Xavier Mathieu is an executive at Nexans, the French cable manufacturer and the second biggest cable company in the world. He has watched the copper to aluminum substitution cycle play out before in building wiring and power cables. His benchmark is simple. When copper costs more than 3.5 times the price of aluminum, manufacturers start switching. As of early 2025, the ratio stood above 4.2 to 1. That ratio is not close to the threshold. It has blown past it, and it has stayed there. Here's the thing. This is not the first time the world has had this conversation. BMW used aluminum conductors in its 1 Series back in 2011. That was 14 years ago. The company has been quietly expanding the practice ever since, through its hybrid lineup and now into its latest eDrive EV technology, where aluminum cables appear in both high voltage and low voltage systems. Ferrari started using aluminum power cables in its 296 hybrid sports car. The company then extended the practice to the Luce, its first fully electric vehicle. Ferrari's communications team confirmed that aluminum wiring saves up to 20% of total wiring weight in those vehicles. Ferrari, the company that builds cars where every component is chosen for performance, not cost. When Ferrari is making this switch, It is not because aluminum is cheap. It is because the engineering case is sound. Stellantis, the fourth biggest automaker in the world, has also started swapping copper for aluminum in some applications, according to a Reuters source. The company declined to comment publicly, but the direction is clear. So you have Tesla doing it since 2019, BMW doing it since 2011, Ferrari doing it now, Stellantis doing it quietly, and China doing it at a scale that dwarfs all of them combined. And now the question that the copper mining industry has to answer is how much demand actually disappears. Norwegian aluminum producer Hydro put a number on the remaining opportunity. About 85% of the electrical wiring bus bars in EVs, the components that connect the battery to the vehicle systems, are still made of copper. 85%. That means the substitution that has already happened is just the first wave. The bulk of the copper in an EV has not been touched yet. Hydro's CFO, Trond Olaf Christoffersen, cited that figure to make the case that aluminum has a long runway ahead of it. He was making a bullish case for aluminum. But read it from the other direction and it is a warning for copper. JP Morgan has modeled this out. In 2025, aluminum substitution affects roughly 2% of annual global copper demand. That sounds small. Global copper demand runs at about 26 million metric tons per year. 2% of that is 520,000 metric tons. That is not a rounding error. That is a medium-sized copper mine's entire annual output, removed from demand. And JP Morgan's scenario for 2030 puts that figure at 6%, 3 times the current impact. If that scenario plays out, the copper market absorbs the loss of roughly 1.5 million metric tons of annual demand compared to where it would have been. Mines that are being planned today, based on demand forecasts built before this policy paper existed, could end up producing copper that the market does not need. Consultancy Zhuochuang, which tracks Chinese metals markets, published its own forecast. By 2030, it projects that 25 to 30% of copper components by metal volume could be replaced by aluminum across power, automotive, and home appliance sectors in China alone. That is a structural shift, not a cyclical dip. Copper demand does not recover from that when prices fall. It recovers only if aluminum wiring fails technically at scale, or if the regulatory environment changes. Neither looks likely right now. Beijing Antaike, a Chinese industry research group, had an analyst named Yang Changhua present at its Wuhan conference in October 2024. Yang's forecast, China's copper demand growth would slow to 1.1% annually through 2030. In the 5 years before that, the growth rate had been 3.9%. That is a drop of more than 2/3 in the growth rate, driven partly by aluminum substitution and partly by a broader slowdown in construction. The copper bulls had been counting on Chinese demand to absorb new mine supply coming online through the late 2020s. That calculation now has a hole in it. But wait, there is a counter-argument, and it's worth taking seriously. The world is also building more power grids. The energy transition requires enormous amounts of new transmission infrastructure. Wind farms, solar installations, battery storage systems, and the high-voltage lines that carry power from where it is generated to where it is used. That infrastructure is copper-intensive, and it is being built at a pace the world has not seen since the mid-20th century. The International Energy Agency has said that reaching net zero emissions by 2050 would require roughly 3 times the current level of grid investment annually. Some of that grid gets built with aluminum. Some of it requires copper. The net effect on copper demand from the energy transition is still positive, even with substitution eating into the automotive share. So the copper market is not collapsing. Let's be clear about that. What is happening is more subtle. The growth story that copper miners were selling to investors, the story where EV adoption automatically means surging copper demand, that story has a significant asterisk on it now. Because the EV makers building the most vehicles in the world's biggest EV market have decided that aluminum is good enough, and their government has told them to use more of it. The people who should be paying the most attention to this are not the EV buyers. It is the mining executives in Chile, Peru, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Australia who are deciding right now whether to approve new copper projects that will take 5 to 10 years to bring into production. Those projects are priced on demand forecasts, and those forecasts are changing. Here's where it gets uncomfortable for the West specifically. The companies leading this substitution are Chinese. The policy driving it is Chinese. The supplier ecosystem scaling up to support it. The Jonver-type companies growing their aluminum wiring business by 50% in 2 years is Chinese. The aluminum industry positioned to benefit is dominated by China, and the recycling infrastructure that Beijing wants to build to 15 million metric tons annually, that is Chinese too. The West is not absent from this story. Tesla started it, BMW has been doing it for 14 years, Ferrari just joined, but the scale is not comparable. China builds more EVs in a month than many Western countries build in a year. When China's government issues a policy paper and China's manufacturers follow it, the market moves. When a Western automaker makes a quiet engineering decision on one model line, it is a footnote. Terry Wojciechowski at Karasoft Global put it plainly. The Chinese EV makers benchmarked Tesla's aluminum wiring approach and then industrialized it faster and at greater scale than Tesla itself. That is the pattern that keeps appearing in this industry. A Western company pioneers something. China studies it, scales it, and then makes it the default. It happened with lithium iron phosphate batteries, it happened with battery management systems, and it is happening now with aluminum wiring. The trade-off is real and worth naming clearly. Aluminum is not a perfect substitute. It has 60% of copper's conductivity. It requires connectors and crimping techniques that are different from copper. Done badly, aluminum wiring can fail, and it has failed in older building wiring applications from the 1960s.